Well, there's been a sharp decline in IPO issuances this year. We're surprised to see a IPO from a gene editing firm called Prime Medicine. This firm actually came up when we talked about Beam Therapeutics earlier, and the bull thesis for gene editing is quite simple. So there are 5,000 diseases out there attributed to genetic mutations. This is sort of the low-hanging fruit. If we look across all industries, all potential applications for this powerful technology, healthcare would be at the top because we value human life very high. So in the future, if humans don't wipe each other off the face of the planet, there'll be a point in time where all genetic diseases will be cured using a single treatment. And unless we start editing at the germline, that means editing fetuses prior to birth, then these therapies will continue to be administered in order to manage all people born with harmful genetic mutations. And given the breadth of this potential application, there's plenty of room for more than one winner. So we last looked at Beam Therapeutics more recently than this piece has covered their IPO, but we noted that this company had a new type of gene editing technology that was more precise than other types. So they equated it to a pencil eraser being able to erase single letters, and they could potentially address hundreds of different applications. They have their intellectual property all wrapped up. And the gentleman who co-founded this along with Prime Medicine and Editas, David Liu, he brought us base editing, and now he's brought us prime editing. Now, when you look at the Beam Therapeutics pipeline, there's a lot of criticisms around how it's moving quite slowly. And the argument is, well, they have this superior technology, so it doesn't really matter how long it takes. And when we look at the other approaches out there, these are some reasons that Prime Medicine gave as to why their technology is superior compared to all other approaches, including base editing used by Beam. So there's no limit to the type of edits that Prime can make or the type of cells that they can make edits in. Their precision is much better, and they don't require double-stranded breaks, which have created problems. And they describe their technology as the find and replace function in a word processor. So seems quite powerful. Now, when you look at their pipeline, they have 18 candidates, all very early stage, and they've categorized them as such. This first category, really like this sentence. They say, deliberately chosen as potentially the fastest, most direct path to demonstrate technological success of prime editing in patients. That's what every gene editing company is trying to do, demonstrate technological success, because these are all technology platforms that can be used potentially to churn out lots of different therapies. So it would be really nice to see one success story that kind of proves the concept. Then they go down to these other categories that they may address severe genetic diseases with therapeutics that could not have been created using other gene editing approaches. So kind of proving the competitive advantage we described in the previous slide. They have blue sky indications and this idea of marching up the chromosome, where they address the full set of mutations in a particular gene as opposed to the dominant one. So these are the various categories in their pipeline, and you can see that the two we've highlighted here at the top, these are the ones that they say are the highest priority. The first being the sickle cell disease treatment they're working on with Beam, and then the second being this disease that I'm not even going to try to pronounce. Let's just call it CGD, and that seems to be the closest when it comes to filing an IND. And you can see the column on the right here that says IND enabling. We're going to talk about that for a second because it's quite important. So IND stands for investigational new drug. The idea here is that if you have a disease that has a high mortality rate, it's killing a lot of people, there's no treatments, no cure, then if there's potentially a cure, that should be fast-tracked because the people are going to die anyway. So if you administer your therapy and they die from the therapy, well, they would have died from the disease anyway. And many of these people are in a very tight spot, and they're willing to try experimental treatments. That's the idea behind the IND exemption that the FDA has provided that allows an unapproved product candidate to be shipped across state lines and administered in humans. And we put some detail here on this 30-day waiting period because it's quite important. If they file for an IND, okay, everybody gets excited, the stock price goes up, and suddenly the FDA says, well, there's a clinical hold while we look into this, and the stock price goes down. This will create a lot of volatility. So it's important to understand that process. Now, the first drug that Prime will file an IND for seems to be this CGD disease that we highlighted in the previous slide, just based on the verbiage in the S1. So they talk about these therapies. It starts to become very complicated, and without any sort of technical background, it's almost impossible to navigate. So you just pay attention to the sections in there that say next steps, and that particular treatment seemed to be furthest along. Now, inside the S1, they also talk about patents and intellectual property. So as of June 2019, there were somewhere around over 2,000 patent families worldwide related to CRISPR gene editing inventions and the use cases. So intellectual property has been debated quite a bit, about the Editas and Broad Institute debate and all that. Well, that's why they make it a point to describe this, what they say, major milestone. This was just 9 days ago. They were granted this, what they call the 770 patent, which they believe will be instrumental in protecting their platform and pipeline of gene editing programs. Now, they've licensed the technology, as is typical in the gene editing world, it seems, from Broad Institute and Harvard. And as part of that, they have this deal called the Pledge. And starting last year, they're going to pay $5 million a year for 14 years, that should say 14, to these two institutions. And David Liu, again, the co-founder of Prime Medicine, he is affiliated with both institutions and has labs there where they produce this technology, and that can be used by his lab. So let's just hope he's not building the next superior method of gene editing that displaces all the ones that we have today. So when we look at Beam Therapeutics and their relationship with Prime Medicine, it's very complicated. In the S1, you can try to make sense of it. It's very difficult. There's lots of options and all sorts of different things going on there that makes it very difficult to understand the status of the relationship. But they do provide some verbiage that gives us some hints. So they say there's no current plans for Dr. Liu to be an officer or director of Prime Medicine, and that he will retain whatever involvement he has with Beam. And then Beam had initially appointed their CEO to Prime's board of directors, but he resigned from that position just several weeks ago. So you can see they're trying to create an arm's length relationship here between Beam and Prime, which seems to make sense. Beam's one of two partners that Prime talks about in their filing, the other being Myeloid. They're providing technology that Prime may need to expand the applicability of their own technology of prime editing. And that's quite interesting because they're actually paying out to Myeloid. So that's as opposed to a partner where they're licensing Beam's technology, this is the opposite. So we found that to be quite interesting. Now, just to conclude, Prime Medicine seems to be a bit behind the eight ball, like Beam Therapeutics, when it comes to progress of their pipeline. But if their technology is as superior as they claim it is, then that means they should be able to progress their pipeline at a decent clip with very few impediments. So we'd like to see more clinical progress from the firm and more partnerships before we'd consider an investment. We've already placed our bets on 3 gene editing companies, and for this one to displace any of those others, they'd have to show more progress. So please put your comments in the comments section. Make sure to subscribe to our channel, and thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation today.